Hello, everybody, and welcome to International Podcast Day 2019. I am Dave Lee, co-founder of International Podcast Day. Steve is in the studio with me as well right now. We have our good friend Yann from Finland joining for the third or fourth International Podcast Day event, Yann?
Good question. Hi, Dave. Hello, everybody. I think it's the third as a speaker, the fourth being involved with the event here.
That sounds correct. So Yann is going to be sharing, teaching through podcasting, how to share your knowledge and leverage podcast as an education tool. Yann always comes with great content and always good information. So stay tuned for that. But briefly, I did want to thank our International Podcast Day sponsors that made this event in 2019 possible. I'd like to thank our platinum sponsor, Blueberry. They're a full-service podcasting company providing podcast hosting, statistics, and advertising opportunities. You can find more out at blueberry.com. And of course, our gold sponsors, repurpose.io. You can automatically convert your audio podcast into engaging videos and upload them to YouTube, Facebook, and other social media channels. You can try it for free simply by heading over to repurpose.io/IPD. And our other gold sponsor, Libsyn. Libsyn is a podcast hosting, distribution, and monetization solution for every audio and video podcaster out there worldwide. Reach your audience everywhere on the most popular audience destinations like Spotify and Pandora. Find more over at libsyn.com. Of course, we can't thank enough our streaming partner this year, StreamYard, over at StreamYard.com. You can sign up for a free account over there. And lastly, I'd like to thank our celebration supporters, Second Line Themes, Geeks Rising Podcast Network, Synth Outlier HQ, and Focusrite. So once again, internationalpodcastday.com/sponsors. Head over there. You're going to find some free giveaways and, of course, discounted services for anybody in the podcasting space. Well, Yann, again, thank you for joining us. We're really excited to have you represent you, yourself, your podcast, and, of course, the nation of Finland. So welcome to International Podcast Day.
Many thanks, Dave, and obviously everybody who's here live or watching the replay, thanks to the sponsors. And yeah, I'm really excited to be back. As Dave mentioned, this is my third time as a speaker, fourth time overall. My name is Yann Ilunga. I represent Finland because I live in Helsinki here, but I also represent a little bit of Switzerland. I know there is somebody else who represents Switzerland because that's where I'm originating from the Italian-speaking part. And I've been podcasting for almost 5 years now. With the different shows I have a virtual summit. I think I published well over 400 episodes and videos as well I've done for the summit, and I'm a podcasting consultant. So I know a thing or two about podcasting. And in this session, I really want to make it all about you, and more specifically about, as Dave mentioned, the title is Teaching Through Podcasting. So how can we actually leverage podcasting as a medium, as an asset for us to share our knowledge? And the presentation is I would say 80% of the presentation is gonna be useful for everybody, even if you aren't an official quote unquote teacher, professor, you don't necessarily work in the educational space. And then the last portion, I'm gonna also talk about a couple of things related more specifically to those who actually teach in a university, secondary school, and things of that nature. If you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I'll make sure that we have a few minutes at the end so that we can go over them. In terms of what we're going to look at, what we're going to learn, we're actually going to look at three different things. The first one, we're going to look at or approach the topic from a macro perspective. So we're going to take a bird's eye view. Then the second part, we're going to look at things with a micro lens. We're going to take our, the lab, whatever it's called, to look at things closer. And then the third part, I mentioned it, we're going to look at basically, let's say, podcasting and education. Let's use that term. The first thing when it comes to the topic here of teaching through podcasting is the actual character, the figure, you, the teacher. So what does it actually mean to be a teacher? Do you have to be a guru with decades of experience? Or is it okay to be somebody who starts teaching through podcasting, even if you have only months of experience or a couple of years? The answer is yes, it is possible. And I would like you to start thinking about the figure of the teacher, not only as a kind of semi-God, I'm going to use that expression, where you are up here and your audience are down here and everybody's worshiping you, but as a person who almost has an horizontal relation where you and your audience are almost on the same way. I use the word almost because obviously you aren't exactly on the same way or the same level because you are a little bit higher than them, and that's where you pass along your information. So when it comes to the teacher, keep in mind that you can be an expert, you can be a guru, but you can also be a journeyman. So share what you are learning through the journey, through the process, the mistakes you're making, the challenges you're facing, you're overcoming. For example, with my podcast, the Podcast Lab, or one of my shows, that's what I do. I teach podcasting, and I do it with a different approach compared to other shows. And one of the things I do sometimes to teach is I run a series of experiments on a series of podcasting related topics. And sometimes the experiments are a complete bust if we just look at the experiment itself. So it's a failure for me, if you will, but it's still a win for the audience because I run the experiment and then I take back the curtain and share everything. So what my hypotheses were, what I expected the result to be, the entire process and everything. So that's where kind of the position in a way of teaching more as a journeyman is, or guinea pig if you prefer. So keep in mind that it is possible for you. You are justified, basically what I'm trying to say, to teach even if you're somebody who doesn't have decades of experience or you don't have, I don't know, a university degree, you aren't a best-selling author, it's fine. Okay? Okay, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's look at the first part here of the session, approaching teaching through podcasting from a macro perspective. So what does it mean? First of all, it means that we should approach the way we plan and organize our content differently. So instead of just saying, well, let's imagine we have a weekly podcast, and instead of just saying, well, this week I'm going to talk about such and such, we should try to have an approach that your professors, teachers had when you were studying. Think about it for a moment. Think about, maybe let's ignore your least favorite professors or teachers. Think about your favorite professors or your favorite subject. If you think about it, each of the things that were taught in the subject was presented to you in a way that was broken into basically a series of subtopics. If you think about the table of content or the syllabus, the curriculum of a course, that's how things work. It's not that if you have a course on, I don't know, interior designing, for example, they just throw everything at you at once. They say, okay, this is the layout of what we're going to cover in this semester, this year, and then you start step by step. So you should have a similar approach when you're planning your content. So instead of saying, okay, I want to talk about interior designing and teach everything there is to teach about interior designing in this episode and try to squeeze in as much information as possible, start to say to yourself, okay, so what can I talk about when it comes to interior designing? And disclaimer, I'm not an interior designing expert. It just came like that as an example. But there you want to think about the different basically layers. An example of that could be, okay, when we talk about interior designing, we could break it down by rooms. Talking about designing interiors for a living room is different than a kitchen or a bathroom or, I don't know, a balcony or, you know, a backyard, whatever it is. I think you see what I mean here. So that's the first thing I would encourage you to do. And if you already have your podcast ongoing, that's completely fine. You can start doing this process and then slightly, or slowly, I should say, apply it and start to change things little by little. So think about how you approach your content. And then once you have kind of created your table of content, that's where you go one layer deeper and say, okay, so these are the topics related to my main subject, interior designing. I will talk about interior designing for kitchen, for living rooms, for this and for that. Then the next step is, okay, when it comes to teaching my audience, my listeners, interior designing for living rooms, what are the steps? What do I want people to learn? And you start to think about those. And then that's where you think about the episode or episodes. Now you know what to cover. And the question becomes, should those things that make sense to cover all in one episode, or are those things that should be presented in a series of episodes? Maybe it's a 2-part series, maybe it's a 5-part series, or perhaps is a season. And if your podcast isn't a season-based podcast, you can still use the season approach in the sense of saying, okay, the next 5 episodes will cover interior designing for living rooms. The 3 episodes after that is going to be a mini series of interior designing for your kitchen. After that, we're going to have a 10-episode series on designing your bedroom, or whatever the thing is. I guess you see what I mean here. So it's important that you start at a macro level. Think about your overall show, the overall basically collection of the episode, or episodes, I should say. Think about how to approach the actual topic, and then basically reverse engineer. So think about the major topic, think about the subtopics or the topics that are related to the main subjects. And actually, let me take a step back. Easier for you to understand. Think about your main topic as a puzzle, and then the subtopics are basically the pieces of a puzzle that, once combined, allow you to paint the picture of the main subject. For example, in my case with the Podcast Lab, that is podcasting. So the overall puzzle is podcasting, and I do series of episodes on different topics: podcast guesting, podcast marketing, podcast monetization, launching a podcast, and so forth. So that's kind of how to think about the macro aspect. Then we have the podcast listening, and I'm going to tell you about that in a second because I need a sip of water. Okay, so podcast listening, what do I mean by podcast listening? Why does it matter? It's actually key, because even though you may be super passionate about what you teach, and you want to share that with your audience, and it's great, you need to keep your listeners in mind. And what I mean by that is that you shouldn't only think about your side of the microphone, allow me that term, but you should also think about listeners and podcasting at 360 degree as a medium or as a learning medium for your audience. So what does that mean? What is a great podcast listening experience made of? Sure, it's made of great content. So it's important for you to be able to basically share what you teach in a way that it's easy for listeners to understand. If you cover something that is very technical, you want to make sure that you present the topic at hand in a manner everybody ideally would understand. Then you want to think about the actual nature of the topic you cover. I mentioned interior designing, and actually that's a great example. That's, if you think about it, that's pretty visual in nature, and it would be easier for the listener to understand certain concepts we would cover in an episode or a series of episodes if he or she had a visual component. It could be a video, it could be an image, it could be a graph, for example, the plan of an apartment or a house or something like that. So that's where the teaching resources come into play. Even though podcasting is great and we're celebrating podcasting for International Podcast Day, we have to keep in mind that there are certain areas that are kind of lacking when somebody is listening to a podcast. In the case of certain topics, the chunk of the lack, it's quite big. Think of topics that are visual in nature, like design, photography, it's another one, architecture could be another one. So that's where we need to think about things, and actually we can use that to our advantage. So for example, if you have a YouTube channel, the teaching material or asset related to the topic of the episode could be something you cover in a short video, and then you use your episode or series of episodes that cover that specific topic to direct your listeners toward your YouTube channel, and more specifically, that video. If you have a downloadable image, a downloadable PDF, something like that, then that would be an opportunity for you to actually generate leads. So it would be a chance to turn some of your listeners into email subscribers. And if you have a business related to your podcast, then you don't need me to tell you about the importance of having an email list. And because of that, it's important, even though you're a podcaster or you're going to be a podcaster, if maybe you're watching this and you're kind of on the fence about getting started with podcasting, you should still have a, let's use the term, multimedia approach. So you have to keep in mind that certain topics are harder to understand using nothing but audio. So you need to kind of compensate that with something else, whether it's a downloadable resource, whether it's a video, whether it's an Instagram story, a Facebook post, a blog post, whatever. But you can use that to your advantage. So then the podcast also becomes a tool you can use to direct people toward other things you have, YouTube channel, your email list, and so forth. So for the podcast listening experience, a great one, we have the content, we have the overall learning / teaching, in the case of your audience, experience. So it's not only about the content, but it's also about how you make it easier in a way for the person to understand and learn the concepts. This is where we have visual components when needed. And then the third element there that it's also important, it's audio quality. And if you've listened to podcasts, you know this by yourself. Audio quality is important. And even though you're focusing on the delivery, the content, and there is no denying that, having good audio is still very important, because it's quite difficult to listen to somebody for a relatively long period of time if there are audio issues. If the audio is, for example, it sounds as if the person is recording or has recorded with the phone in the bathroom, or sounds as if they recorded in a tunnel or walking next to the highway. I guess you see my point here. So these are the kind of the things to think about when it comes to teaching through podcasting from a macro perspective. So here's where we think about the overall show, the content at a macro level. This is where we think about the listening experience we want to create for our audience. And this is also where we think about the connections of our podcast with other possible things we have: YouTube channel, email list, downloadable resources. So this is for the macro aspect. Now let's turn the page and let's look at the micro aspect. So what do I actually mean by micro? With the micro, we kind of switch or shift the focus on basically from far to closer. And you will understand what I mean by that very shortly. With the micro approach, with the macro approach, we have kind of painted the borders of what within we're gonna work in. And with the micro, we start to actually focus on the individual pieces of the puzzle. Think about the actual best way to actually teach interior designing for your living room. And this is where we think about the actual episode, we think about the actual structure of the episode, the actual format of the episode. So should we teach interior designing for your living room in an episode, in a 2-part episode, in a 5-part episode, in a season-long series of episodes? Then you want to think about, should the episode be audio only? Should the episode be combined with audio and visual components? Then think about guests. Are guests or people other than yourself people who would be part of the teaching experience? Yes, no. And when you're thinking about a guest, think about how would he or she contribute to the actual learning for your listeners. Would the guest you bring in, or guests, if you have more than one, that you bring in, teach basically the entire thing, the entire series of episodes? Or would the guest or guests teach only a couple of the steps involved in the basically learning journey for your listener? These are all things you have to think about. And the best or the easiest way to do that is think about the actual learning goal for listeners for an episode and a series of episodes, if you have that. and then reverse engineer and say, okay, by the time a person has finished listening to this episode or to this series of episodes or to this season, he or she is gonna learn about ABC. Now that you know what the learning outcome is, you wanna reverse engineer and say, okay, what are the steps that we should have the listener take? What are the examples we should bring? What are the strategies we should discuss and so forth? What is the content we should provide listeners with so that they can take the necessary steps to go and reach ABC? Once you have identified those, and my advice would be, well, you can be an old school person and use pen and paper, but I would recommend using a digital tool. I'm a big fan of project management tools. Systems is actually one of the things I focus on quite a lot as well, both in the podcasting space as well as systems for business. And when it comes to organizing these aspects of your show, I would recommend using a project management tool. I use one called ClickUp. I've used Trello in the past. There is Asana, there is Notion. There is many options. It doesn't really matter which one you use, but I think it's easier to have digital tools because it's easier than to link to resources and cross-link and these kind of things. Whereas with pen and paper, you're kind of limited only to the offline world. So if you have a project management tool, you want to think about what is the learning goal for your audience, what are the steps that would take your listeners there. And then if you want to think about having guests, think about, okay, this specific guest, how would he or she help? Would he or she basically provide the roadmap all the way to the learning goal, or would he or she provide only or take people only halfway, a third of the way? And that doesn't make a guest better or worse, but it makes it easier for you as the teacher to know kind of what role you want the guest to play in the context of this teaching that you're putting together. And that's also then easier for you because if, for example, and I have a music business show called the Jazz Spotlight. I used to have a business podcast called the 360 Entrepreneur, which did 230 episodes. And so I've done a bunch of interviews. And sometimes some people interview other people just because. But if you have this approach, you will know exactly how you want this specific guest or series of guests to contribute to the episode. So where of their expertise on interior designing for living rooms you want them to put emphasis on? Is it on the actual layout of the living room? Is it on the furniture? Is it on a specific piece of furniture? Is it on a furniture made of a certain material, furniture made of certain fabric, certain colors, certain patterns? You see what I mean here. So doing all this will make it easier for you in the long term or the long run to choose guests if you decide to have guests. And if you have a couple of different people that you are thinking, well, should I go with guest A or guest B? Having this learning or teaching, if we look at your perspective roadmap, map out in your project management tool, is going to make it easier for you to know whether you should go for guest A or guest B. As I said early on, we're going to have some minutes at the end for questions. So if you're watching live, feel free to pop some questions here in the chat. And if you are actually watching the video, the replay, feel free to connect with me. You'll find me on Twitter at the Yann Ilunga. So, so THE and then Yann Ilunga. Feel free to tweet at me there. And yeah, keep them coming. Okay, so now we have gotten kind of the first steps in the micro dimension. Now the next thing we have to think about is once we basically have mapped out all those things, we know what we're going to cover in a specific episode or in a series of episodes. How do we proceed next? The first thing you should do is never wing it. And wing it, the reason why I say never wing it, in my experience, especially when I'm a guest on other people's podcasts, and sometimes people say, well, just want that we have a spontaneous conversation, so I'm not going to send you any pointers. Oftentimes, those are the podcasts where once we finished recording, I'm like, oh, I should have mentioned this. It would have made so much sense, but it slipped my mind. Because of that, I would recommend that you always have some pointers written down in front of you. I use, as I said, project management tool, even when I'm recording. So even if you're recording solo, having some pointers will make sure, first of all, that you don't forget to mention something that is key. And in addition to that, it will also help you understand where we are with the learning or teaching from the listener's perspective and where we are heading toward. In other words, if you plan your episode in a project management tool and you use, for example, bullet points, that's how I do. I have bullet points with keywords or key sentences or things like that. As you're recording and you have that in front of you, it's going to be easier for you to transition from what you're talking about right now to basically the next chapter of the episode, because you can visually see, okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is this. So you're going to be able to make a transition, a connection that makes sense. And in addition to that, if you already have quite the big archive of podcast episodes, or you have been blogging for a while, you have videos, whatever, having your bullet points also make it easier for you to mention basically teaching material, resources, content that is related to the topic that you're covering. So you don't have to try to guess. You map those out, and when you're recording, you're going to be able to mention the right resource, the right person, the right book, the right podcast episode at the right time. And you're not going to be, oh, yeah, by the way, sorry, guys, I forgot 5 minutes ago, I should have mentioned this thing. Apologies, I didn't. But by mapping things out, you will be able to avoid making that mistake. Then, in even more practical terms, when it comes to the actual hosting, my advice is start by telling people what you're gonna talk about in the episode, what people are gonna learn. So by the time you're done listening with the episode, you're gonna learn more about how to leverage podcasting as a teaching asset, for example. If you think about it, at the beginning of the streaming, I briefly did that and I said, okay, this is what we cover and this is how we're gonna cover it. I say we're gonna have basically 3 parts: the macro, the micro, and then the third part that is more for those that are already educators. So you want to do that. And if you have consumed content online, especially YouTube videos, you've probably heard people saying, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So for us, in the context of this session, the twist I would add to that is tell them what they're going to learn, teach them, and then recap what you taught them. So give people a preview of what we're going to dive into and do your job as an educator, as a podcaster. And once you're finished, make sure that you do a short recap of what's been covered. And you have to always keep in mind as you're recording that most people who listen to you won't be in front of their computer. Some people may be walking the dog, some people may be driving, some people may be at the gym. So as you organize your content, as you plan your content, and then as you record, you have to keep that at the back of your mind. And it's especially the third part, so tell them what you just taught them. It's very key. That's where you want to take a moment to let what you taught sink in, and then summarizes it so that it's basically, you're tying the bow and that's it, or you put the icing on top of the cake. So this is what basically goes into the planning and the actual hosting of an episode. And then the final step related to that is the call to action. And you probably have heard the term call to action before. And what I would encourage you to do, start to think about possible call to actions, not only as something that you say, well, I use it to grow my email list or to mention my YouTube channel or my new book or this or that, but think of them as the natural next step to what was covered in an episode. So for example, if we cover interior design for living rooms, and then you mention, a PDF with some images, examples of what you talked about in the episode, that is the natural next step for somebody that has listened to the episode. And remember, if somebody is listening to the episode, or if somebody started listening to the episode, is because he or she was interested in the topic that the episode covered. So if you have a call to action that focuses on a next step that is connected to the topic of the actual episode, chances of people taking that step are quite high. But if you're talking about interior designing for living rooms, and then your call to action is for your other project that is, I don't know, bird photography, people are going to be like, what? Why is this? Why is Yann mentioning bird photography? There is no connection between the two things. So think about call to action as the next step. And ideally, you want to have one call to action. So you may say, well, I have this YouTube video, and then I have this downloadable PDF, and I have this, and I have that, and that's okay. But you want to have one call to action. So if, for example, you have several, let's say you have a YouTube video and a downloadable PDF, then my advice would be to basically pack them in your call to action, add the links or opt-in forms or whatever on a show notes page, and your call to action should focus on the show note page. So you would say, okay, I mentioned this PDF, I mentioned the YouTube video where I actually filmed my living room and how I designed it and all this kind of stuff. And you can get access to both in my show note page over at, and then you mention it. So even if you have several things you would want to mention, focus on that specific call to action, or not focus on a specific call to action, but have one specific call to action. And sometimes, as I said, you may have more than just an individual resource. And that's why I would recommend then adding the links in the show note page, and then mention the show note page as the final call to action. So this is basically what you need to think about when it comes to the micro. So when it comes to actually planning your episodes and then recording your episodes. And then obviously keep in mind that sometimes the teaching, the conversation also goes beyond your podcast. So this isn't something we're really gonna cover here much in depth, but you wanna keep in mind that people may reach out by email and on social media and any other way. And that's a way for you to engage, but at the same time, should also be a way for you to think about the topic you're teaching. Because, for example, it may happen that somebody asks you a question about interior design for living rooms that didn't even cross your mind, or maybe it's a question that it's the first time somebody asks you. So what you can do there, you can answer the question if you have the answer to the question, but also make a note of what the question was about, because that could be a very interesting topic to cover in an upcoming episode. It could be a topic to cover a few months from now, if maybe you do an update of the specific topic you covered. Maybe you cover the topic toward the end of a year, and then you say, well, we're gonna revisit the topic next summer or something like that, or next season. So it's important for you to always keep in mind, and that's also why earlier I was saying that the relationship with the audience shouldn't be vertical, but should be almost horizontal, where the information or the exchange, it's mostly monodirectional or unidirectional. It's you sharing the information, but sometimes your audience is gonna pitch in, and you should be aware of that, because sometimes those kind of aspects, questions, come to you in an unexpected form. It's not that somebody says, well, hey, okay, just to let you know, I was thinking about this and I think you should add this to your episode. And you can use surveys and those kind of things to see what people want to learn more about. But oftentimes, these are the questions where, if you are mindful, if you are careful in a way, and don't only say, oh, wow, I got a question from my audience, but you take a moment to say, oh, nice, I got a question. Where in the grand scheme of things does this question fit in? Is this a question for a potential future topic to cover? Is this a question to update the topic we just covered? Is this a question for something that I didn't plan on covering? But then I realized, well, I got that question from one person, from two people, three people, five. Maybe I should reconsider that and maybe a good idea to cover that. So if you're a person who maybe, well, I don't know what to cover a few months from now, using the approach we mentioned earlier in the macro of the table of content and breaking down topics further. So for example, in my case, what I did with the podcast lab, instead of saying, oh yeah, in this episode, we're gonna cover, I don't know, podcast monetization, and I shared everything and I just threw everything the listeners' way, I actually did a series of episodes. I don't remember, I think it's maybe like some 7-8 episodes that covered podcast monetization. So by having that approach, you decrease the likelihood of finding yourself wondering what to cover in weeks to come, because instead of throwing everything in one episode, you basically spread out the knowledge, the teaching in a series of episodes. So that approach is going to help you having more content long term. And then also this last point I made of being mindful of when you get the questions, and not only limit yourself to answering the question or ignore the questions or whatever, but to really think about the question and how that fits within what you're doing. Because sometimes one question could spark a great idea. And I'm not saying that you should, for example, if you have or if you get questions about things you weren't planning on covering, you should create an episode for each question you get, but you should definitely have a way, and a project management tool is great for that, to document those, because you're gonna find that not only one person had that question, but somebody asked you that question a couple of months ago. So it may be worth your time to actually take in a moment and actually perhaps record an episode or series of episodes that cover that question or the topic or the points that the question touched upon. Okay, so this is for the micro and how to teach through podcasting using a micro approach, if I dare to use that term. Now, in these final minutes, before I look at the chat in case there are any questions, I'm going to talk about the part that, as I said, it's more for those of you who are already educators. So if you're watching this, whether live or the replay, and you are a teacher, a professor, or somebody that works in the educational space, then this part is for you. I recently did a podcasting workshop for professors at a University of Applied Science here in a town not far from Helsinki. And as I was preparing for that workshop, one of the things I did is I did a search to see if there are universities that have incorporated podcasting into their curriculum. And I was positively surprised to see that, for example, Oxford University has, the Open University has, and then I saw other universities, I think like Yale, UCLA, I know Harvard has had a podcasting event or conference, and I think they will have it again. So it's definitely something that it's starting to become more and more part of the overall educational space, which I think it's a great thing. So if you represent if you represent a school or a university, an institution that teaches, that it's involved in education, definitely think that if companies like Oxford and others I mentioned leverage podcast, it's definitely a good sign. And I think it's a sign that you should think about podcasts as well. Then when it comes to podcasting as a teaching asset, in an ideal world, I would tell you, yeah, just basically replace everything you're doing teaching-wise and just do it with audio. But you and I both know that that isn't possible. So what I would invite you to do, and obviously this, what I'm about to say, it's something that will affect you, or its implementation will vary depending on your position and the power you have within the school, university, and so forth. But I would encourage you to start thinking about using podcasting as a teaching asset and think about how you could plug podcasts into your curriculum. Perhaps podcasts could be a great way for you to give a preview of upcoming classes, or use audio as a way to help students prepare to an upcoming class. So it's a sort of preview. Or maybe podcasts can actually be a deep dive a follow-up to a class. So you have the in-person class, and then students have the chance to listen to a podcast to dive deeper into what was covered in the class. You can also think about guest lecturers. One of the advantages of using podcasts, especially in this case in an educational context, is that you can potentially, through a simple podcast interview or panel of discussion or co-hosted podcast, you could have a guest professor, a guest expert who is in the other side of the world become part of your teaching curriculum practically for free, because you don't have to worry about flying him or her over, the accommodation and all those kind of things. And many people, if not most people, are definitely open to do a podcast interview for free. Or if the school, the university pitches in, invests some money, the amount spent, invested is still going to be way lower than if they had to actually fly the person over. So keep that in mind as well as you're thinking about your curriculum. Keep in mind that podcasts can also be a great way for you to kind of magnet in or use them as a magnet to draw in a guest lecturer or experts, however you want to think about them. And the last point when it comes to podcasting within your teaching curriculum, another way of using them potentially is to not necessarily replace, but associate podcasting or listen to a specific podcast or a couple of episodes with a series of required readings. Chances are during your study time, you had some kind of required readings. Some were probably really heavy and boring, and some were really exciting. But the point here is that you can think of ways to either pair the required reading assignment with podcasts. So add, for example, a podcast episode to the list of resources, essays, books students need to read. Or you could even say, okay, instead of having required readings, we're going to have, for example, 1 week required readings, the next week required, listenings, I think is the term we would use. And that's where you would add in podcasts. And it can be specific episodes you recorded, or it can even be like in the academic space, episodes published by other people. So like you do essays, it's not that usually you don't only share, for example, the book you have written or an essay you have published in an academic journal, but you also share learning and educational assets by other professors, scholars, and so forth. So you can do the same with podcasting. So why actually using podcasting as an educator? Here I mentioned a few reasons why, and I think, to make it crystal clear in case you haven't used podcasts, for example, in that space, it's an easier medium to leverage compared to video. The barrier of entry is lower, the costs are lower, and then the consumption, more and more people, students included, especially students, young people, listen to stuff. So if you teach through audio, you basically make it easier to enter their routine or to make listening to your educational content part of their routine. For example, if somebody commutes, like in my case, when I did my bachelor at a university in Switzerland, I had basically an hour and a half commute, 45 minutes one way, 45 minutes back by train. And back then, there wasn't really podcasts and internet connections were expensive. Wi-Fi's, you would find them only in like 1 or 2 places. But had I been in that position today, it would be perfect if my professors had required listenings. It would be perfect for me because I knew I would have to sit on the train anyways for 45 minutes one way. So why not to basically take advantage of that and listen to podcasts? And then the last point is if, for example, you want to take things one step further and not only use podcasts as an educational asset, as a teaching asset, but you also want to use it as something that empowers students, then you could even consider having students leverage podcasts as part of their curriculum, as what can be an assignment. And you don't need to have students purchase professional equipment and all these kind of things, but simply having a basic, even smartphone app, for example, and a headset like this would be more than fine when it comes to obviously the purpose of the course. I'm not talking about a production that you would put in together. That's a bit different. But when it comes to students, it would be really empowering because they would be creating content, and at the same time, they would be learning a little bit more about podcasting, and they would start to create content that potentially could be beneficial, or not the content necessarily, but basically learning how to podcast, even the basics of podcasting. It's something that could come back in handy a few years later. An example of that, in my case, I mentioned when I was doing my bachelor in Switzerland. Back then, I learned how to use Audacity, and that was maybe 12 years ago. And after that lesson, never used Audacity until I started podcasting 5 years ago, give or take. So that's something that I think can be useful for you, or a reason, or an additional reason why you should consider having podcast as an educator. So to summarize here, before I quickly take a look at the chat in case we have questions, what should you think about and do as an educator? Start from the macro. So think about the overall show, the style of the show. Is it a one episode and then we move on to the next topic? Is it a series of episodes? Is it a season? Remember that it's fine for you to be the expert, the teacher, even if you aren't a guru, even if you are somebody who's kind of a journeyman. Then think about breaking, whenever possible, unpack the concepts further so that you get more basically juice for your podcast. Instead of covering something in one episode, you may be able to break it down into smaller chunks and cover that in 10 episodes or over 10 episodes. Keep in mind, podcast listening is not only made of content, but it's made of listening experience, learning. So that's where visual components come in handy, downloadable resources, videos, images, and things like that. Then you want to think about the micro. So think about the episode specific level, the learning path. What is a person going to learn with an episode? Think about the call to action. What is the call to action going to be? Think about or tell people what they're going to learn, teach them, and then tell them or recap, summarize what you taught them. And then this last part here of the session, podcasting in education, this is more to kind of inspire you. I'm trying to spark something here to make you think about how you could potentially incorporate podcasting into your teaching curriculum. So now I'm gonna quickly switch tab and see if there are some questions here in the chat. And if you are watching the replay of this, then I would invite you to, as I said, you can connect with me if you have questions on Twitter, for example, at the Yann Ilunga. But the final call to action for everybody, especially those watching the replay, if you're interested in chatting, in connecting, I also have a community of podcasters completely for free that I would invite you to join. It's called Podcast Growth Mastermind. And you can join it if you go to yannilunga.com/community. So that's YANNILUNGA.com, yannilunga.com/community. Especially those watching the replay, if you're interested in
Yann, I think one of the important things is to know how to spell your last name, and because pronunciations are always interesting across the globe, and that's. But hey, you're always a magnificent guest. We love having you all the time. You're such an asset to the entire community of podcasting. You do some of your own online content that you do every year, and it's just always a pleasure to have you around, and you're a very important place in the podcasting space. So thanks a million.
Thank you, Steve.
Dave went off to bed, so I'm taking over, and we have a lot of hours still to come.
Right. Well, I wish you a great continuation of International Podcast Day, and a great International Podcast Day to everybody, whether it's here with us in real time or is watching the replay.
Very good. So we're going to wrap this up and get ready for the next guest. We're going to head over to France now with Lori. So, Yann, thanks once again. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. See you, Steve.
Take care.